Conquer fan, what's going on? It's Coach Time Palms with Coach Jared Gordon. Another Conquer chat, bringing you guys on this fine Thursday. Hope you guys are all having a great day. We got a fun video for you guys. I guess we can call it fun at least. We're gonna be talking about as an athlete, what you should be focused on, whether it's rowing, running, or biking, and or skiing too. I guess we can kind of mix in there the forgotten machine, if you will. And we're going to talk about different types of athletes, where you want to be spending your time training, or which one should be the priority and focus. We'll talk about individual differences, levels of athletes, and things of that nature. Just as important, Davante Adams is on the market in the NFL right now. And me being a Jet fan, that makes it even more important that he might get traded there. So that's where we're going to start this conversation. Hope you guys like football. If you don't, I'm sorry, because that's all we really talk about other than CrossFit is football.
I don't know. What I've heard is he wants to go either there or the Saints, right? And I get that because
All
he's
I've heard
got
is he
some.
wants to be a Jet.
No, I heard the Saints too because of that connection with Carr. And Carr's actually looked good this year.
Carr.
He
I
didn't
think
look
he
like he's
hates
lost.
Carr. I'm like 99% sure he hates Carr. No, he hates Garoppolo. I'm sorry. You're right. He doesn't
Yeah,
hate Carr.
yeah.
Yeah,
He played
yeah,
with
yeah.
Carr in college. So I
That's
mean,
right. That's
Saints
right.
are rolling. I don't know.
Saints have a good team, and Jets are a bit of a mess as always. So I wouldn't blame him. I would
Yeah,
love him
it
to.
might come down to what taxes look like because I know taxes vary so much from like state to state, and I imagine New York's got to be hellaciously high
New York is
compared to
terrible.
yeah.
It's terrible. Yeah, if it's a money thing, well, yeah, good luck. But yeah, we'll find out. We'll find out. Moving to New York in the winter sounds like a great idea. Um,
I mean, he
all
was in
right,
Green Bay, so he gets
that's
that.
true. He gets it at least. That's true. All right, let's get to it, buddy. All right, athletes, rowing, biking, skiing, running. We're gonna throw skiing in the mix too. What how does an athlete know which they should be prioritizing and why? That's the topic.
Yeah. I know we tossed skiing in there, and I feel like I love the ski erg. I love that movement. It's just it doesn't show up as much. So I feel like that one obviously for me at least takes the back burner because I mean, how many times have you gone to a competition to see a ski? You're more likely to see an echo bike or an assault bike and a rower and running than you are a ski.
Got that right?
So I definitely like using the machine. I think it's fantastic, but it's probably fourth on my list. I will
Okay.
be slightly biased um, on those three remaining machines. I personally think running has greater carryover to the other two, despite the fact that rowing definitely requires a lot of technique, biking not so much. But I really can't think of hardly any instances where people who are exceptional runners don't do well on the bike or the row. But I can think of instances where people who are amazing at the bike and at the row can't run for shit. Like they don't have that capacity at all.
That's fair. I think there is a strong carryover from runners to the machines. I will definitely agree with that a lot. I can 100% say that. Okay, that's a good starting point. So you're saying that your number one priority is to make people good runners.
I think it has a greater I think it has a bigger carryover to the other two versus rowing doesn't really carry over to running and biking as much or biking to the other two. And I think maybe the biggest reason is just time on your feet. It has that carryover. You have to support your own weight where, being a big person running is a disadvantage. Being a big person on the rower and bike is an advantage.
Yep, I agree with that as well. Do you think that running also carries over into the sport of CrossFit?
If I had to pick the movement that probably has the strongest carryover, it probably is rowing. That's just my perspective. I think it's more of a full body thing. But if we're just looking at which of those three I would prioritize, I would still pick the running. But we see rowing probably more frequently than the other movements. So I understand why that would be why some people would think that would have a high correlation toward how well you perform in CrossFit.
Fair. So I will say that I think that it would be I think they all have great carryover into the sport for sure, and they all have a part of pieces within workouts sometimes. So they're all commonly used, especially in live events, right? I actually, just from my own personal feedback as an athlete, when I was a good runner, I felt my fittest.
Hmm.
I always felt in workouts very fit when I was running frequently. And that probably does have to do part with me when I would work out for CrossFit, train for CrossFit. I was like a little bit heavier typically. And so, like rowing and biking, and I have long limbs. So, rowing and biking were always good movements for me. So,
Hmm.
when I ran, I just felt like there was better carryover for when I was doing things like box jumps and burpees and double unders and things of that nature. And I actually think it is because it's that although you're not using your upper body when you're running, but like you said, having to support your body weight, I think that had a huge carryover because every movement you're doing in CrossFit, you're typically supporting your body weight plus an external movement, potentially external object rather, right? So I actually felt really good when I was a good runner. When I was a good rower, you know, I was also relatively fit. Um, but running seemed to have just like the largest carryover to me personally. Now I also think they all have kind of a unique feel to them and have different carryover for different movements. You can make some argument that like the assault bike helps with like leg endurance, right?
Hmm.
Like, quad dominant movements. So there might be some carryover into things like wall balls and thrusters and anything where there's going to be a lot of knee flexion and extension like that. Similarly, with a rower, you definitely have a little bit more posterior chain activation, right? And there's some pulling with the upper body. So I think there is some like, endurance benefits to movements like deadlifts and power cleans and anything where you're kind of pulling and hinging off the floor. So I think they all have a great place, right? And so right there, we've kind of named the a lot of the benefits behind the machines and why we think they're important in the sport. The last thing I guess I'll say, because you kind of mentioned it, was like what we see the most in the sport, and I agree. Like rowing, if we're prepping for open and quarterfinals, like you got to be a good rower. Like
Hmm.
like you're not going to see an assault bike or an echo bike at all. You just know that you're not going to see running for distance. You'll see shuttle runs, but it's just not the same. It's not
No.
the same as running. I think anyone who's done the two often can say that and agree with that. So I wouldn't say that it has great carryover to shuttle runs really. Like of course it does because it's running, but like it's just not the same. So in my opinion, like you have to be a good rower for sure. Like it just has to be there for qualifiers if you want to compete at the highest level. And then, so with that being said, I would say that is the most important movement of all of them to get good at first.
Hmm.
How about yourself?
Well, let me backtrack for a second. Do you favor certain movements for certain um, types of adaptation? So, like, let me give you an example. I think it's really hard to sprint on the rower. Like, it's you can sprint for maybe like 30 seconds, but you can't do like a 5 second sprint. It takes too long to get the
Mm,
flywheel
mm-hmm,
moving. Same thing with the ski erg. I
mm-hmm.
love do sprints on, well, I don't love personally doing them, but I love to prescribe like short echo bike or assault bike sprints because the chance of injury, very, very low. The
Yep.
chance of injury if you try to do like a regular sprint outside, very, very
Yeah.
high. Somebody's gonna pop a hamstring if they're not really warm. So like for short, intense bursts, like the bikes are great. I love that. I don't think there's any machine that can replicate those quite the same. If somebody's going to be doing, again, depends on how good of a runner they are mechanic wise. If it's anything like 30 minutes, I'm okay with that. I'd rather not have them run for like hours on end, especially if I don't know how their mechanics are, how they change as they break down. If it's something longer, I might put them on a bike or a row. But do you have any biases yourself where you kind of prescribe certain things for certain times?
Yeah, no, I would agree with the bike is amazing for like power development, like to get that type of adaptation, like that's definitely the route I like to go for sure. And like running, if you're confident with the person, like I think of course obviously sprinting is just like amazing. Um, Especially just from like a biomechanic kind of thinking wise, and the carryover it has to like jumping and things of that nature. So I like sprinting for sure. So I would agree with that. I wouldn't, 5, 10 second sprints on the rower unless you have to just be super specific there for that athlete. I think, you're right in that regard. Um, Depending upon the athlete, I will send people on some longer runs. The more advanced they are in the sport, I definitely will send them on longer runs because it can be tested at those events. Like to do a 5K or 10K is a possibility. Who knows in this sport? It could always be longer. So
Mhm.
I do have to get people comfortable being on their feet, and I do think it's easier to sit in that zone at run. Not easier. I guess like it's not easy to sit in like zone two when you're running. You have to be very skilled and fit to do that. But if you can, I like that adaptation a lot personally. So it definitely depends upon the athlete, but with the power development for sure, I definitely agree. And then anything in the middle there, I think I typically tend to stay on the shorter side with assault bikes than I do for in comparison to rowing and running.
Yeah.
And I think that's just because of how it's tested typically. We don't see someone having to do like something on the bike for 3 minutes or 4 minutes and then go do a movement and repeat like we do at semifinals where we have to do an 800-meter run, go do 10 clean and jerks for 5 rounds. Like it's typically like get on the assault bike and sprint your ass off and then go do something else, right?
Right.
So it's just more specific, and I think that's probably why I bias that. But yeah, so that's a good starting point.
When it comes to row, how much do you emphasize technique? Because that's something that uh, certainly deteriorates, the longer in the workout it goes, especially if it's something like, what was the one open workout? It was like a short row, deadlift, and
Yeah.
maybe double unders or something like
Yeah,
that.
this is past
You
year. That
know,
was the second workout from the Open.
yeah, and that workout, it was very much a rowing workout, at least from my perspective. But, how much do you spend on technique with your athletes, or do you just kind of assume that they have enough grasp that they can handle it and move proficiently there?
Yeah, just like actually answering that question. Honestly, I don't spend that much time on technique.
Hmm.
With the amount of volume that athletes need to do and training that's done, there's only so much time for so many things. So unless their technique is just absolutely atrocious on a rower, I'm probably not spending time on technique where something like a ring muscle up or a clean or a snatch, the carryover to having amazing technique in those movements versus a rower with amazing technique. I think there's just larger carryover to those high skilled movements where like you can have pretty shit technique on a rowing machine and still be a decent rower. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Um,
Agreed.
just from watching, and observing, right? So that's kind of my reasoning behind that answer.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's very minimal for me, and maybe like the greatest extent that I'll mess with their technique is I'll prescribe them like a stroke rate that I want them to hit. If I watch them
Mm.
and they're pulling 35 strokes a minute for no apparent reason, like okay, during the workout, it's longer, you're going to settle in at 26, and you're going to hold that the entire time. You're still going to try to maintain this output throughout, so that they're minimizing the amount of effort they're putting forth in terms of repetition and their breathing and trying to get a better control of things. But yeah, I agree. It's not something that I really spend a whole lot on, other than like little tweaks like that.
No, I like that stroke. That I like a lot, like stroke rate and being more efficient on the rower in that regard. is definitely a great strategy to teach athletes how to do. For sure. What other questions do we have on this? Where are your thoughts going with the row bike run?
Well, again, I think that it depends on what time of the year the athlete is in or where they're at in their training. Like as you said, like you're ramping up toward the open. Yeah, I'm going to shift away from running and biking and spend more time on rowing because that's going to have the greatest impact on what they do in the open and quarterfinals potentially and beyond those things. If it's the off season, quote off season, like it's right now, it's finally got to a point around here in Virginia where it's not like 90 degrees, it's like 70 degrees. Like, cool. You're going to be stuck inside for the winter. Like, let's get outside and let's run a lot. Let's enjoy the weather. And, sometimes just even breaking that tendency of being in the same spot for 20, 30 minutes at a time, like on a bike or rower, is just a nice break for them. So I think it just depends on the time of year. I like to have my athletes run when they're able to. And then obviously when certain things dictate that they need to focus on bike or row or ski because they have an upcoming local competition, online qualifier, then things certainly shift to bias toward those things.
Yeah, I agree with that as well, for sure. You know, so I think the question that we should answer is like, well, what should I work on if I'm an athlete? Like, how do I know and like what should I work on? And so my general just like answer would be this personally. I would first master the rower just because of the use it has within the sport on online qualifying events. And although the main event is in person, you have to be able to qualify for that event first. So if you're not good on that rower, you're not going to be able to potentially go to these in person events. So get really good at that thing, get comfortable on it, know your paces, know what you can sustain for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, right? Know what calories per hour you're holding in AMRAPs when there's 14 calories versus having to do 50 calories, right? Know your paces, know yourself really well, know what stroke rate you prefer to pull at, right? Some athletes like a longer, more powerful pull. Myself, when I was an athlete and I was a very solid rower, I had a high stroke rate all the time. I was able to keep my heart rate down. It was great. And that's how I preferred to row. Know all these things about the rower and master that. Then I would say that once you feel like you are just extremely proficient on a rower and you are great at it, and you can do it well inside mixed modal workouts because that starts to change things, you
Mm-hmm.
can then start to look at either the assault bike or running. And so here's the thing. I think most of the time people who are pretty good at rowing, like you said, are probably also decently good at the assault bike. You just tend to see more larger and powerful athletes be good at both those machines. And then you're probably not as good as a runner. If you're someone who's good at rowing but not good at the assault bike, that's probably the next route I would go. I think there's carryover into the sport. I think that there's a lot of things you can do on it. Just from a mental standpoint, doing assault bike intervals makes you a better athlete, right? They're just painful, and like that's a part of the sport that you got to be able to also apply. Um, there's great leg endurance adaptations that come through it, resiliency, like I said, heart rate you training you can do through the roof there, power development. Not great for long sustained type effort stuff, in my opinion. But that would be my next route. If you are good at both machines and like you're really not worried about the assault bike, then it's a no brainer. Go and move into running and start getting better at running for sure.
Yeah, I think, it depends on the approach of what the athlete wants to do, right? If they want to compete, then yeah, I don't disagree with the order at all of what you're talking about. You just need to be you need to be proficient at the row. You need to be very, very comfortable with your paces, your stroke rate, all the things that you alluded to. If you're more of like an everyday athlete or somebody who's like, hey, I like doing the local competitions, I still personally would kind of shift them slightly toward the running. Not because, I think it's more important than rowing and biking, but I think that I've just personally seen that stronger runners make stronger rowers and bikers. Again, because technique notwithstanding, you can still like hammer away. And I'll use an example. I had an athlete come to my gym who was an ultra runner. So he would get on the rower and bike, just no technique, but could sit there and just absolutely rip and hold that the entire time. Um, and I have people that can pull, they'll row a 125, 500, and they can't run under a 7 minute mile. Like they have nothing there. They don't have any capacity in that. But
Okay,
I
so
very
I want to play devil's advocate really fast here.
sure.
So you gave me an example of someone who could row 500 and 125, but can't run a sub 7 minute mile. Could that athlete run a very fast 400 meter?
No, no, like
Okay.
they'd be lucky to run like a 130 would be really that probably close to like a 140 is what they're going to hit.
Okay.
They're again a bigger athlete, heavier athlete. They do really well with that. They produce a lot of power. They just don't have any type of sustained ability to run to carry their body weight. And I see the same thing when they try to do things like fast box jumps. If that makes sense, they can't move terribly quick there. They can move methodically and they can move consistently, but they don't have the ability to be like boom and hit those with speed and some intensity, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean I agree with that. Like the running aspect does have that really good carryover, like for sure. The reason I just asked that question is because the two energy systems that would be utilized in both of those tests are a little bit different. So I was
Sure.
just wondering if if it was an energy system development issue versus like a modality issue. But yeah, I definitely totally agree with that. I do think there is high carryover from running into those machines. So that's a fair point. What would be your next movement after running? Where would you go?
It would have to be rowing. It would just have to be because it's the most common thing. And I'll say this about rowing too is if you have a rower in your gym, it's a concept two rower,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's across the board. Now, if you hop on, you go to a gym, it might have an assault bike, it might have an echo bike, and those things have a very, very different feel. And so they're just not the same. But you hop on a rower, it's going to be a rower no matter where you go. And so there's consistency there. Um, but again, if you want to try to compete, you want to try to be a better athlete, rowing just shows up more often than bike does. I mean, how many times have you ever seen bike show up at like a .com workout? I don't, maybe like 5 times, maybe ever. It's never
Yeah.
shown up in any other type of open or quarterfinal workout. Semis and things like that are different, but you don't see it at the lower levels there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Okay. So now I want to get better at rowing. Where do I start? What should I do? I have technique and I've been doing CrossFit for 2 years. So I have experience on it. And like I said, I believe my technique is generally good. I wouldn't say that's my issue. Like, what should I do? What do you think?
I would start with looking at a 500 row, a 2K row, and a 5K row, just because those are pretty comparable. Those are pretty well-known benchmarks that are easy to see where they're falling. If they're hitting like a 130 500 and they're rowing a 745 2K, we know that there's some work to be done there. Or they're rowing I don't know, let's say a 20-minute 5K and when they're rowing a 130 500. So I would use those benchmarks as a place to figure out where it is they need to emphasize their focus. Is it the longer duration? Is it that middle range of like that 7 to 9 minutes, or is it the short stuff? But that's absolutely where I would start.
That's a great way to look at it. Now, okay, I'm great at the 500. I'm okay, yeah, so like my max 500 is a 140, but I could row a 5K sustaining a 155.
Mm-hmm.
What does that person have to do?
140, 155. It's I would say that neither of those stand out to me as like being fairly deficient. If anything, I would probably focus more on the 500 when I think about it. Being able to hold a 155 for 20 minutes is in comparison to that 140, there's too much of the gap is too close. It needs to be bigger. So spending more time in that shorter duration is where they would ultimately want to focus. And then I feel like it's always like this moving dials, right? You move one, this gets better. Now I have to go and move the other. So it might be a point where they get to, the 500 becomes their strength, and now we got to go back and work on their 5K or that 20-minute range because now they've deteriorated there. We need to bring those levels back to a more even balance.
Exactly. No, I would agree. And like just looking at that from a comparison, someone who could sustain a 155 for a 5K that's fairly aerobic, right? And then someone who can only roll 140 for a 500, I would say you lack a lot of power, right? And so, I would spend more time developing power, and who knows if that's because they're just not strong in general, or they just don't know how to create power on the rower and kind of push themselves in that system. But that's kind of why I wanted to bring up that comparison, just to show that, like, okay, if you're someone who can sustain longer efforts and it's like and that pace is relatively close to what you could do for a max effort, you got to push the area where we can create power versus the person who can do a 500 in a 125 like you said, but then does a 5K in like 20 minutes. You're like, okay, well, you're powerful, we have to work on sustaining that power, right? And do things that are going to allow you to be able to express the power you have a lot better, right? And repeat it in workouts, because that same person who could do like a 125 500 might have a tough time doing, multiple rounds of 500 within a workout just because they're aerobically not very fit. So
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to paint a picture for people based upon where they're at and where kind of their metrics at by using that 500, 2K, and 5K kind of test to know, okay, where should I spend some time training?
How much utility do you place in those standalone numbers in comparison to introducing those things in a mixed modal setting? So again, you have your 500, your 2K, your 5K time on a rower. Um, how much credence do you give that as you mix that into a mixed modal setting? Does that mean a lot to you, or are you looking for different contractions to see where they tend to you know uh, fall short or really start to fatigue quick?
Yeah, so I do two tests. Okay, so I'll do a test of a 5K row and a standalone and see what their score is. And let's just say they get 20 minutes to just make it an easy number.
Mhm.
That means you're holding a 2 minute per 500 meter split. I'll then give another test that's 10 rounds for time, 500 meter row, 15 burpees to a plate, which comes out to 5,000 meters of rowing. And I want to see what that pace ends up being in that workout per 500 meter split. And if it's similar, I know that gives me a few things. In a perfect world, that pace would be exactly the same in a perfect world.
Mhm.
Typically, it's not, it's a little bit slower because we're mixing burpees in there.
Mhm.
So I would say I would look first, like, okay, what is the 5K score? The 5K score and the 500 meter that they're sustaining in the mixed modal workout are very similar. That's a great sign. And it also shows me, like, do I need to work on doing more mixed modal rowing type workouts, or do I need to just improve the row if the row isn't good, right? Vice versa, if they're great with the row on its own, but then you just see a massive drop off in pace in the 10 round workout, I go, okay, they're good rowing by itself. Let's start mixing this into some CrossFit style workouts and start building pace through that.
Mhm. Do you think it's more important to like so let's go back and say like that their row is not as efficient during that row burpee combination, that burpee couplet? Do you spend your time focused on continuing to improve their row with some sort of interference, or do you go just straight back to rowing only?
Just depend. It depends what the row in isolation is. The row in isolation checks the box. Like, if they can, like, for example, when I was a rower, I in CrossFit, like, I was able to sustain a 145 for a 5K.
Mhm.
Right. So like that checks the box, like in a CrossFit, as an athlete. So me
Show off.
doing rowing, just to paint a picture, me doing rowing in isolation couldn't be a bigger waste of my time. Like
Mhm.
there's so many other things, right? Because if we get a rowing event that's in isolation, like I'm gonna be able, and my 2K row was good too, right? It was like 6:30. So like I didn't have deficiencies in any kind of aspect of rowing. So I didn't need to work on isolation. Complete waste of my time. Like, okay, how and I was just a good rower. So like in workouts, if I had a rower, it was like, oh, this is gonna be a great score for me.
Mhm.
So, but let's just say it wasn't that case. Like, yeah, the minute I start having to do, anything with a row and another movement, it becomes poor. That's the only place I'm going to spend my time because building it in isolation wouldn't matter anymore because it's already really good. Continuing to make that better isn't going to make it any better when I start mixing it. And that could also just be a mixed modality issue, not so much rowing in mixed modality. It could be just that like you're not good at mixed modal, and that's where we'll have to start thinking about some things. But if I don't check the box in the 5K and 2K row in isolation, then that's where you start first because it might just be like, okay, you're just not a good rower. And that's why you're getting even more chewed up when we start combining it with things, right? Like you can't row well by itself, and now we're adding fatigue to that row. Like, of course, it's not going to be good. So let's make you efficient on that rower first, and then let's start adding in some mixed elements to it.
Mhm. No,
That's
I
how I do.
100% agree. Um, let me ask one question that I don't think people ever think about, but I think depending on what the workout is for the athlete, it makes a huge difference. What's your preference when it comes to, let's just say with rowing? Do you like to prescribe calories or do you like to prescribe distance? And I say that because, like, as an example, sometimes people will try to make that comparison. Oh, 200 meters is 20 calories. And it couldn't be further from the truth. It might burn 20 calories in doing 200 meters, but you can also rip through 20 calories in, you know, let's say 20 seconds, but a 200 meter or a 250 meters is going to take you closer to 40, 45 seconds. Does that make sense? The disparity in how those measure and how the athlete accumulates those things is very different. So do you like to prefer one or the other, or do you tend to mix and match?
Yeah, I actually I definitely tend to start I tend to focus more on the meters side of things just because of the benchmarks too of the 500 2K 5K and just like knowing that pace. I think the pace is very accurate, and to be able to it's very measurable. I should say not accurate, it's very measurable. And I just have more data around like what you should be able to hold for a 500 2K 5K. And most the rowing of the sport itself, which we have a lot of literature on, is mainly talked about in terms of meters. So I just tend to utilize meters for that reason, even though workouts have some calories per hour. I think that as long as you're improving in meters, like using that as a measurement, you're also going to improve on the calories per hour side of
Mhm.
things. Like, so I just tend to use meters for that reason.
Mhm. No, 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 I like it. But I think it's one thing that people just may overlook, and they think that it's similar, just the same that if you look at somebody who can, if you say 50 cal bike,
Mm.
and you might want that to take, I don't know, 2.5 minutes, something like that. But some of these big hosses are going to sprint that in 37 seconds, and that could be a very different feel. Like you want them to take 2.5 minutes. That's what you're intending in the middle of the workout, and instead they did it in 40 seconds. It completely changed what the intent of the workout should feel like in the stimulus. So I think it's important to articulate and think about those things when you're writing workouts, because otherwise, some of those things can get completely um, thrown off just by a little change in units.
No, that's a very good point. Because cows, you can definitely change how fast you can go, like you said, in comparison to like a distance. Distance is just going to take time to accumulate. Where cows, you can really, I mean, sometimes you could do 2 cows per pull on a rower if you're really ripping. You know what I mean? Where it's not going to just go up meters like that. So, no, I think that's a,
You
a
can,
very
not
fair
me.
argument. Maybe a couple times. That's it. Um, yeah, bro, but I love it. That was a great talk. I think that gave people a lot of inside information on how to assess rowing, biking, running, what they should be doing, how they should be getting better at it, how they should be viewing it. Any kind of concluding thoughts on it?
Uh, no, I think it's just, and all things being equal, it comes down to looking at what you suck at, right? What's of those three, what needs the most work, and just like anything else, go and hammer that. And then when you brought that up, what else do you suck at? And then go hammer the next thing. And that's what it is to be an athlete. You just have to continue to rotate and find the things that you are not good at and work on them until you become better. So it's no different with any of those modalities.
Couldn't agree more, my man. All right, guys. Well, that's going to conclude this talk. We'll catch you guys next Thursday. Hope you enjoyed it.